Thank you, Tony. This is such a pleasure for me to come back to Chicago, as I love to do every time. In fact, I always tell people that I'm really a small-town person, but if I were ever forced to live in a big city, Chicago would be that place, really. And coming from someone like me who, even though I grew up near New York, is not really a fan of New York or the attitude or the people. It is just, like I said, it's just so much fun for me to come back in this context. And this is the first time I have ever been wanted for my body. And so I thought with that we would give a little introduction here that will sort of let you all know just what kind of body you've invited to talk to you tonight, so that if they'll play this, we'll start. What it is a short film clip of the 1972 Olympic Marathon, in which I did pretty well.
September 10th, 1972, the Munich Olympic Stadium. 71 runners gather for the start of the marathon race. Mama Wolde, age 40, will try to duplicate Abebe Bikila's feat of 2 successive Olympic victories. The Munich Olympic Committee has
the interesting
Abebe
thing
to
about
witness
this
the attempt.
is the tone presents the marathon really as this exotic
Mamo is not the
event
favorite.
that is so
Ron Hill of Great Britain, a veteran of the
excruciating
Tokyo and
and
Mexico City
difficult
marathons, is picked by most to
that
win the
only a
gold
very
medal
few can
that
do it.
eluded him twice before. 3 other marathoners are given
And
good
now we know
chances.
that's not true.
Derek
That's
Clayton,
part of what I'm going to
Australia,
talk to you
Carol
about
Lismont,
today is the
Belgium,
evolution
and
of
Frank
the
Shorter,
race
United States.
over time in
leave the
society in
stadium.
general. And again, with the idea of
At
bodies.
10 kilometers,
It
Clayton
used to be
takes over the
thought
lead,
that only
followed by
certain
Hill.
bodies could do
Gaston
something like
Rollins of
this, and
Belgium,
now
the
we know so
3,000
much
meter
better.
steeplechase winner in Tokyo, moves
But
into 6th
coming up pretty
place.
close, you're going to
Clayton's
see
pace has been
a
exhausting.
very good
He
example
slows it down.
of my muscle definition. Because again, they're trying to show just how, again, it's so tough, it's so hot, it's so far. Well, we all know they weren't in Chicago 3 years ago.
Frank
I
Shorter
didn't
of the
know.
United States
But here we
takes
go.
a bold chance. Now he sprints away from the pack.
Marty LaCourie once described me as a vertical hyphen.
Kenny Moore, United States, moves into 2nd place, followed by Mamo Wolde, Ethiopia, and Carol Lismont, Belgium. They are more than a minute in back of Shorter, some 400 meters behind. Shorter moves relentlessly on.
Oh, all that weight work.
At 35 kilometers, he increases his lead to almost 2 minutes. Shorter is all alone. With each stride, he increases his lead. Nine runners have fallen exhausted to the pavement. 2 have to be hospitalized.
And this is what I mean, the idea that
Now Shorter
it
approaches
was,
the stadium.
Yes, it's an incredible race. And in the Olympics, it is considered, in essence, the marquee event. It has the status of being the only event of the last day of the Olympic Games on the closing ceremony. But what I want to talk about is that, yes, that was my
Shorter's
unique
time,
experience,
2
but now we
hours,
all know
12
that
minutes,
many other people
19
can have the
and
same
8/10
one.
seconds.
The human body is incredible in that
He is the
just
first
about
United
anyone
States
without
marathon
a
winner
health problem or
since Johnny
complication,
Hayes' victory
we
in
now know today can do
1908.
something like this.
In 2nd position, Carol Lismont, Belgium.
He was the one guy you never wanted to turn around and see behind you, and naturally, his job in Belgium
Mamo
now
Wolde,
is,
Ethiopia,
I swear to
3rd.
you, he is the equivalent of an IRS agent. He's a tax guy.
Frank Frank Shorter looks forward to the Montreal Olympic Games in 1976, when he will attempt to duplicate Abebe Bikila's record of 2 successive marathon
And the fact
gold
that I went
medals.
back in 1976 and tried to duplicate it really went a little bit beyond the fact that I didn't want to get a real job, and that I even though I went on to graduate from law school and pass the bar, I didn't particularly want to get a job. Well, and again, here I am. I find myself here, and I love the idea of karma in full circles. And I'd also like to mention, just for everybody here, I found my way here tonight without GPS. Okay? And the reason is, I'd run up and down the lakeshore for years and years, as Tony said, Tony and Carl and I, and I think it's interesting too that I was going back to remember some of the names of the first group of runners that I was with here in Chicago, who were really the driving force behind the establishment of the Chicago Marathon. And 2 of the names I remembered along with Tony and Carl were Wendell Miller, and another one, I almost slipped my mind today, but then I said, no, it's Randy Seed, and Randy Seed is here tonight. So I love the fact that we bodies who are distance runners know how to endure, and we do show up. The other name that comes to mind that I wish were here was someone who was involved with the Chicago Marathon for many years, Jack Isherwood, who was the president of Heilemann Brewery. And what's so interesting about our sport, and I say our sport now again because we now know that the marathon, and the way I like to put it is, the marathon truly, as opposed to those 1972 Olympic Games, today has become demystified. And I love that. I love the fact that it has. And as I said, it's because everyone who has a human body has realized that there's a very good chance that if they want to complete a marathon, they can. The other interesting fact that I like about the circles is we are celebrating, as a coincidence of the Chicago Humanities Festival, the 2,500th anniversary of the run from Marathon to Athens by Phidippides in ancient Greece to announce the victory over the Persians that has become the marathon. He ran the 25 miles, and there are many versions of what happened, but basically was he ran and he announced that victory is ours and dropped dead. And again, this idea that the marathon was a thing only a certain number of human beings could do. And I found that out in my first marathon, which was in 1971. It was the Pan American Games trial race in Eugene, Oregon. I was running it simply because the track trials, I was a 10,000-meter runner at Yale because no one ran further than that, except for Eric Siegel, who would come out and run laps around the indoor track, and we all thought he was crazy, who then coincidentally became the commentator for that Olympic race on ABC television. But I was in my first race, and I'd never run that far before. I'd done a lot of training, and I was trained to do it. But I turned to the fellow I was running with at 22 miles in that first race, a fellow named Kenny Moore, who you saw in that film. He went on to finish 4th in that Olympic Games. I turned to Kenny at 22 miles of the 26-mile race. And you have to remember the distance from Marathon to Athens was 25 miles. And I said to Kenny, why couldn't Phidippides have died here? And I did. And and I bring that up because any of you out there in the audience who have run a marathon know that 22-mile mark in the race is that point at which most people start to feel something's going on. And there'll be several teaching moments, I hope, in my presentation. One of them is basic physiology. You have 2,000 calories of glycogen in your body, in your liver and your muscles, and you burn it at about 100 a mile. You do the math. You're running out at about 20. You're burning some fat all the way along the way. So it makes sense about 22 miles, your body's telling you something's really changing here. And so there is a reason for it. But again, now everybody kind of knows that that's the way it is. And what happened, I think, after this victory in 1972 was, for me, I just decided, you know, in those kind of situations, how you deal with success. And my way of deciding to deal with it was to simply go back to what I was doing, let it settle in, and finish the other projects in which I was involved, which at that point was law school, and see what I was going to do. So I did that, and I decided I wanted to go back to another Olympics. So I did. I didn't take the normal social route at the time, which was, you know, the French have a word for it. They call it divertissement, diversion. At that time, you were supposed to finish out, no matter what your level of success in something like the Olympic Games, and then you were supposed to go back and get on with your life and do something significant or important, career-wise. That was really the American standard, the social standard at the time. And I decided that I wasn't going to do it. So I went back to law school, finished, passed the bar, started the businesses that Tony talked about, went to the Olympic Games the second time, and finished, to which Tony alluded, behind an East German. And we now know, through the records that we uncovered when the wall went down in 1989, that basically their entire Olympic team was on drugs. In fact, my son and daughter-in-law are just finishing, well, Kira's finished her PhD, my son's finishing up down in Illinois in mechanical engineering. There are actually unpublished PhDs in cheating in Germany because they were actually doing research on their administration of all these drugs in order to cheat better. And so we have these records. And so that really, in a way, is a bridge to the second part of the presentation, which is the performance-enhancing drugs. Well, I would hope you would grant me that having finished second at the time to someone I knew was enhanced, and then for many years to really never have been able to say anything about it, because even at the time, any sort of statement about suspicion would have been viewed as sour grapes. But once the wall went down and the information started to come out, then people, you know, we could start to talk. But before I get into the drug part of it, I want to kind of finish up on the point I wanted to make about the marathon distance itself and the demystification. You see, after my run in 1976, ironically, there started a running boom in the United States. The result was the Chicago Marathon, other major marathons, lots of road races springing up. And I call it the first wave of the running boom. And the interesting thing about it, even at the time, if you remember historically, there were tennis booms. A tennis boom, where, you know, everyone for a while, years ago, was playing tennis, and then it kind of died out. So everyone expected this running thing to sort of literally run its course and die out. The interest would go away. And the people who were in the races, because we were young, we were concerned about time and performance and perhaps where we finished in our age group. And the conversation after a race would be not so much how'd you do it, was, well, what was your time? You know? And what eventually happened, though, over the years, was a transition and an evolution up to where we are today. And again, the dynamic of the race, how people run it, has obviously changed at the elite level, but the dynamic back in the pack is totally different from anything anyone would have imagined 30 years ago. And what evolved over those years was what I call people who took up the activity to run for other people and other reasons. And primarily for charity, but sometimes it was for personal goals or something else. And what people discovered, and what I want to also sort of emphasize here is, the activity is very simple. The training for it is very simple. And that's what helped in the demystification. of it. All you have to do is commit to doing a certain amount of very hard training for perhaps a 3-month period. 80 to 90% of that training is just very easy running, just like we do along the lakefront. If you want to run a marathon, you add to that a ramping up of one run you might take a week to a long distance that will indicate to you that you can complete the marathon distance. Beyond that, if you want to race faster, then there's special training you can do on a track. Once a week is all you need to do. 3 things, that's all you need. One way to put it is, if you're looking for a coach, if you have someone like me coaching you, I will coach you the way I was coached at Yale, which was to coach myself. All you have to know are those 3 elements, and have faith in it and be very consistent in the training, and you can eventually run a marathon. You see, that's what I mean about the demystification of the activity. And what I like about it, too, is that it gets into something that I like to do in my presentations, which is I have what I call a rule of 3. And I like to convey information in bundles of 3. Well, those are the 3 things. 1, all you have to do if you want to run a marathon is do a heck of a lot of running at a pace at which you can carry on a conversation. And that's it. So you're staying aerobic. 2, once a week, be able to go out and stay out there and just endure. And 3, if you want to race faster, then you can find a local club or you can go to a track once a week and do some training. And Tony and Carl Razik will tell you that's what we've done for years. It's very, very simple. There really was no mystery to it. And the other part is, all you have to remember is what I refer to as that glycogen depletion. You know, the idea that in that race, when you do it, once you start to deplete, you're going to feel bad, you know, and everyone does. And the British even have a word for them. They call them bad patches. And what you discover, and I think one of the beauties of the race and the distance, that in that sense, it's the perfect distance. It happened to be 25 miles initially. No one knew the physiology at the time. No one knew the physiology in 1896 when they revised the Olympic Games and decided to have a marathon. But in that sense, it just turned out, serendipity, to be the perfect distance to test yourself, your body, physically and mentally. Because what you learn, and anybody in the room here who's run a marathon will nod their heads when I say, yeah, and you learn if you run through those bad patches, you come out the other side. And, you know, that's the beauty of the event. Now, what I like about the fact that, one of the things I enjoy about it, is that since so many people have run marathons from such a wider segment of our society worldwide than we would have ever thought possible, even 10 years ago, when I then come to start to talk to people about the other side of the presentation tonight, which are the performance-enhancing drugs, a lot of people will have an understanding of what I'm saying in terms of their having experienced really putting themselves to the maximum effort. So that when I make an effort to explain the impact of these drugs on those kinds of performances at a high level, they can understand. Or to put it another way, they don't look at me like I'm a fringe lunatic. Because part of society's reaction whenever you explain something in extreme terms, and in this case, because the extreme aspect of it is based on the knowledge I have from all my work on the drug testing agency, which I actually helped to start. Tony alluded to my coming up with the concept of the trust fund for amateur athletics, which opened up all amateur sport to prize money. That was, I guess, time number 1 that I used my legal education. And then time number 2 was when I wrote up the memoranda for Barry McCaffrey, Clinton's drug czar in the White House, that became the structure of the US Anti-Doping Agency. So that's major time number 2. So I have made use of those 3 years. It wasn't extensive use. And but it had an impact. It had an impact in either area. So, you know, what I realized in that 1976 Olympic Games, which again, if you go back historically, when people say, well, when did performance-enhancing drugs come to predominate the Olympic Games, all you have to do is say 1976, look how many medals the East Germans won, more medals in that Olympics than any other country, 20 million people. You know, as Shrek would say, end of story. I mean, that's when the paradigm shifted with regard to drugs. And, you know, that's when I realized, when I was again, for many years trying to come to grips with that, you know, I really did realize that as, again, Tony said, some of us really do believe in the level playing field. I mean, we honestly believe. We want to know how well we can do, you know. I want to find out, you know, where I'm going to level off. For me, going to the Olympics wasn't to try to win a medal. It was more a discovery to see how far my training could take me and to find out when I was going to no longer improve. And that's where I got. And so it never occurred to me to do anything other than train to try to achieve that performance. Because for me, it was a very personal thing. And again, when I talk about how I enjoy discussing it today much more than I did 15 or 20 years ago, because now so many other people understand. Because, again, the marathon has become an all-inclusive sport. It's become inclusive rather than exclusive, and people can understand when you talk about individual goals and effort. And so when the opportunity came to do something about it, again, those situations and for me, in terms of how you use, and the other reason I wanted to show the clip of the Olympics was, you know, you have choices, and everybody talks about choices, and usually it's the drug cheats who say, oh, I made a bad choice. Well, did you really take the drugs? No, I just made bad choices. There is actually someone out here who said that on Oprah. And, well, it means you took the drug? No, I just made bad choices. But, you know, when you're on the other side of it, and you finally see windows open so that you have an opportunity to use your notoriety, and perhaps because of where I come from, you know, in terms of education and let's all face it, connections and friendships. You know, when you have a chance to do something, for instance, in passing the trust fund so that the amateurs could earn money. Well, when I saw the opportunity to form the independent US Anti-Doping Agency, I knew that that was a window that wasn't going to open again, if ever. For a long time, if ever. And just to give you some history as to how this happened, and in 1999, all of sport in the world, in terms of drugs and testing for the performance-enhancing drugs, all the testing was done by the federations who were in charge of the sports. And this gets into the second part in the performance-enhancing drugs, because there's another rule, or of three, that I want to use here. We all knew, the federations, the athletes, everyone, with regard to performance-enhancing drugs, the basic problem is they work too well. They're too good. They give you too much of an advantage. They speed up your recovery too much, okay? That's the first thing. The second is what I've learned with regard to having been involved in setting up the US Anti-Doping Agency, and what I suggested to Barry McCaffrey as he put together the structure that he was going to convince the US Olympic Committee that they would adopt. The other is very basic. I heard someone draw a breath when I said, yeah, the people doing the testings were the federations that were in charge of the sports. Well, that's rule number 2. You can't promote and police, period. Given human nature, you cannot have this kind of problem be one of that magnitude and have it be addressed and have any sort of success in any other structure than one in which the people doing the monitoring, the testing, the adjudication, the imposing of the penalties, handling the appeals, doing the research and the education, they have to be totally independent of any agency or any federation. And then the other part of it is those agencies that are independent have to be totally outside any influence beyond the sport, political influence, because unless these agencies test out of competition on a frequent basis in order to what we now know we can do in terms of establishing a profile of hormones and other physiological readings that can really indicate over time if someone, is taking these drugs. If you're not doing that, nothing's going to happen. And so I bring that up, and then I'll go back and try to fill it out. They work too well. There's a drug called erythropoietin, EPO. It enhances red cell production in bone marrow. This gives you, and the research comes in a marathon, it gives you a 2% advantage. You actually run 2% faster. 2% over the length of a marathon is 4 minutes for the men, about 8 minutes for the women. I'll maintain that I don't care what certain people want to, I hope I'm not being too facetious here, but some people would like to argue that no, they're genetically gifted and somehow they can overcome this advantage because they just happen to have a certain mutation and just happen to have selected this particular sport. It just doesn't work. They work too well. To put it in terms of the training, if you were the average person wanting to train for your marathon, you could probably train, if you were on any of these drugs, you could train 2 and 3 times harder than you do. Because not only do they work too well in terms of the advantage they give you, they speed up physiologically in terms of just the production in EPO, for example, of the red cells. They speed up your recovery and training so much that you can really put in much, much more training than anyone can. Now, in the history of what we had to overcome initially when we got involved and actually became an agency that wanted to catch people who were cheating and do the testing. And by the way, parenthetically, what I want to emphasize here is that for me personally, I didn't get into the process because I wanted anything personal, any kind of redemption. I did it because I realized in the year 2000, I think historically we're going to look back, when these independent agencies took over, in the year 2000, any high school kid anywhere in the world who wanted to be at an elite level in pretty much any sport knew they were going to have to go on performance-enhancing drugs. That was just the way it was. I did a piece for NPR 2-3 years ago, and I said, look, if all this talk about EPO and human growth hormone and steroids is making your eyes glaze over, just ask your teenage kids, they'll explain it to you. Okay? And I realized that if this weren't being done, that, well, something had to be done. We couldn't go on, and parenthetically, I think the NFL is discovering that their human growth hormone problem is now so big that they're in danger of losing franchise quarterbacks every weekend. But I'll get into that a little bit later. The idea that you can't promote and police. Best example I can think of in recent years, it was in the papers. This isn't inside information, but it's something that you have to understand. If you have a reporter who likes the tickets, likes the beer, and likes the, access, they're not apt to be too emphatic about the way they present the story. When Major League Baseball, several years ago, if those of you remember, and this time now, recently, they said, oh, we're going to do some pilot testing for human growth hormone. And, well, to back up just a little, and this leads into point number 3. So we have, they work too well. You can't promote and police. Human growth hormone, which we all hear about now, which essentially is the same as steroids in terms of their effect. They cost a little more and they give you a big jaw. They enhance the continued growth of the flat bones in your body. One of the major ways to spot someone on human growth hormone is they can truly lead with their chin. And it's been around since 1982, and until the year 2000, no drug testing agency in the world was trying to come up with a test for it. 18 years. And then the independent agencies came in and we started trying to find a test, okay? Can't promote and police. Other example, when Major League Baseball was going to institute their pilot program on the minors to show they didn't have a steroid problem, they were going to do testing, they would announce the test, and 8% of the people still got caught. So it really wasn't a drug test, it was an intelligence test. Because they would essentially publish a how-to manual of how to avoid, okay? And then the other thing that we called them on and we caught them on, which really didn't make much press, they were taking the most promising players in the minors that year, bringing them up to the majors, putting them on the bench and not playing them. Okay. All right? All right. Come to the third, which is you have to do this testing on an unannounced basis all year round, developing profiles. And you see, I think if you remember these 3, as you read through all of the stalling and stonewalling that professional sports are going through in this country, it'll start to make sense to you, because all they're trying to avoid are these 3 things. At the same time, making the appearance that they're actually doing something, the way the International Olympic Committee was doing the same thing when initially confronted with the idea that they were going to have to give up the drug testing to an independent agency. And so with this testing over time, you have to set up this program where the athlete doesn't know where it's going to happen. So, I have to go back to number 2. You can't promote and police. When we took over US AntiDoping Agency in the year 2000 after the Sydney Olympic Games, I can't go into the reasons how we got the International Olympic Committee to give up testing. It certainly wasn't in their self-interest. We took over after the Sydney Olympics. At that Olympics, again, not mentioned in the press very much, the Australians had come up with a new urine test for this EPO, this drug that showed you were producing these red cells in your bone marrow. And what we do now is we don't tell the athletes what's going on. That's why you have the Alberto Contador situation now. It wasn't announced that they had a new, more sophisticated test for the steroid he was taking in tiny doses. That's another story. And now we don't tell people. At the 2000 Olympic Games, the head of the International Olympic Committee Drug Committee stood up at the initial press conference and said, oh, guess what? We have a new test for EPO, and its effectiveness window is 72 hours. okay? You can't promote and police. And there are a lot of people who flew home that afternoon because their events weren't for a while, okay? And so, again, even though when you have the independent agencies, the testing has to be out of competition year-round. And so this is more of information to you that, again, even in situations where you think the problem is close to solution, you run up against other problems. And this one happens to be the countries around the world in amateur sport, the Olympic sport, which have their own independent world testing agency. Many of these countries still do not have their own independent drug testing agencies within the country. An example of that would be Jamaica had tremendous success in the last Olympics in sprinting. Jamaica formed their anti-doping agency 3 days into the Beijing Olympic Games. Okay? You know, all this stuff that you wonder how this doesn't get reported. And the other problem is, with regard to certain nations, particularly developing nations, just as with East Germany, which was not a developing nation, realized there is much prestige and influence through corruption to be gained through not being so diligent about their drug testing under this system. Many are very, very reluctant to, one, establish the agencies, and two, do any testing on their own athletes, many of whom are living here in the United States, on an ongoing basis out of competition to establish these hormone profiles. And so that's what we're still fighting that. Now, what I can give you is some good news. The myth, just as there was a myth about the marathon in terms of what an incredible, excruciating, feat of endurance it was, and it took a very special person to do it, which was one of the reasons I kind of got into it, because all these guys would be saying, oh yeah, the marathon. I mean, I run every Sunday 20 miles, I'll run a marathon. Well, I found out, but everybody finds out. The good news is the myth that, if you remember, you don't hear it much anymore, but remember you used to hear, oh, we can't keep up with these cheaters. Every time we come up with a test for something, they find something new. We just can't stay ahead of them. Total myth. If you remember, there was no test for human growth hormone from 1982 to 2000. There was no test for EPO from 1988 until 2000, okay? They were not developing tests for what they knew people were taking. Well, what we also did at USADA was we started to move up the food chain. So now anybody who's interested in doing one of these designer drugs that athletes can take in an attempt to beat the system, rather than just getting status within the drug subculture, these guys do jail time. So we have started to make some advances, and the tests now, since we don't tell anyone what we're doing, we have created a certain level of deterrence that set a certain amount of fear and trepidation amongst those who, when they were in high school, chose to cheat, because they are now going back to old technology. Before this drug called EPO, which enhanced the red cell production in your bone marrow, in 1970, some Finnish doctors were treating one of their steeplechasers for anemia. They took out some of his blood, spun it down, put it back in plasma, put it back in him, and he broke the world record. And just like Alex Rodriguez, who admitted to taking steroids, they said to themselves, well, that worked so well, I think I won't ever do it again. And so the Finnish athletes from 1970 on were using this procedure called blood doping. And this is one of the procedures that we can now detect. And we now know as an agency, not to go into too much detail, that the athletes really know we're on them on the EPO test and the new generation of tests, because we get cooperation through the drug companies now, and they give us markers for the new products. So the newer generations of all these drugs, we get markers for. So you can see nothing new is coming out there to be used. So the athletes are going back to the old technology, 30, 40-year-old technology. And Mr. Contador, in the recent Tour de France situation, a test was developed that could actually detect the leaching of the plastic from a transfusion bag into the blood. And we didn't tell anybody about that. So read the papers, follow that one. And that's good news. Because if you think about it, it's not that the word is everyone's taking a new drug. The word is there isn't anything new out there. They're just scrambling around trying to, revamp the old technology. So just to finish up, and they wanted me to finish so you could ask some questions, but I think, to sum up, I think it's pretty obvious. The rules are three, right? You outsource, you don't let people promote and police, you adopt and see that the Olympic standards are actually enforced. And I guess the third one, a fourth that I could ask, I could add, is just as we moved up the food chain with regard to the people that are developing these drugs, we have to also move up the food chain with regard to the agents, and the entourages, and everyone else who's involved in this process. And, here, we're in the law school. Let's figure out a way to go after them for fraud. Because it is a fraud, if you think about it. It's absolutely a fraud. And the other thing people really never think about is taking these drugs is a crime. It's against the law to do that. And they're actually prosecuting athletes in Finland and Italy now for that. So again, this is what you do. How this applies to U.S. professional sport, I was at congressional hearings in 2005 sitting next to Fear and Seelig and Bettman from baseball and hockey. And I was there as an example of what you could do, just what I've outlined to you tonight. I was there. I said, here's the model. This is what we do. You can see we've had a certain amount of success. Call us up and ask us. We don't have to run it, but we'll tell you what we found out works. I mean, just as in our sport of running, cross-pollination, educating others as to what works is just like science. It's like sharing the science. And obviously no interest. So until there can be some congressional pressure on the professional sports, you're still going to see the pretend to do something and hope the media writes about it and goes away. So in conclusion, I just want to tell you again why I'm in it, and then I'll open it up for questions. But, why, it all circles back. There was a window. I saw I could get involved with it, and it was because I wanted teenagers to have a choice. I wanted to go back to the point where a kid can be 13 years old and really look at their heroes, male and female, and say, I want to emulate that person. And I know, because I hang around the locker room, that I don't have to do this other thing. It's for them. But you know what? As I think about it more and more, I want to remember, and I hope you all try to remember, and give in my own mind anonymous recognition to all those young athletes over the last 35 years who are in that same position of choice and decided not to do it because they decided to forego, and their names we'll never know. So I think we can change that. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you. We have a mic out there. Yeah.
Well, if you could just raise your hand, I'll come to you, and if you could stand up when you're speaking.
I missed the first few minutes of your talk, so I hope I'm not asking something you've already answered. But is it your? I have two questions. Is it your belief that many of the people that perform at the highest levels are using performance-enhancing drugs in general, and also, is it your belief that there are health risks? Is that why you're? I mean, if everyone used them, the playing field
Right.
would be level. So, is it your view that they cause dangerous health conditions?
Well, I did get into that because of the emulation, and you bring up a very good aspect of it, which is, freedom of choice. If I want to destroy my body, I'm free to do it. But I think once you get to a certain level, my belief is you are a role model. And if some young person has decided to emulate you, and that includes using the drugs that they know you're taking, and then they go on and experience real health problems, no, I think that's wrong. Now, another thing to watch out, and that's why I'm glad you asked the question. One, everyone used to say, and I call it the New England Journal of Medicine argument/defense, which is, if it hasn't been published in the New England Journal of Medicine, I choose not to believe it. Okay? And with regard to the drugs, obviously that's a problem because of the Hippocratic Oath, and you can't set up double-blind empirical studies and give people overdoses of this stuff and have a control group and see what happens. You can't do that. So you need the longitudinal studies. Well, they're starting to come in, and yes, there is the long-term health implications. As with most of these, they're coming from Europe. They're not coming from the United States. So yes, I think there is a counter to the argument of free choice and free will here. And again, being in the law school, I think you also have the argument in our society, we forget there's an aspect of our law which is the greatest good for the greatest number. And there's certain sort of individual freedoms and choices that you can be required. And the other part of it is participating in these events is a privilege and not a right. So you don't have the right within the context of an athletic competition in which everyone has tacitly agreed to testing to say, no, I choose not to do it. You have to do it because it's part of your, contract, your agreement. So no, I think the health issue very soon will sort of be laid to rest. And again, it's one of those arguments that, not to minimize it, but it was one of those arguments that went along with the, we're always behind them. It was a very, you can always throw that out. And I think that's all I want to say on that.
Would you just pass this down? Thank you.
I have a question that follows that a little bit. Thank you so much. This is such an interesting topic. I really appreciate your talk. I'm very interested in the ethical distinction between some of these drugs and the other technologies that we use in sports. So in the example of EPO, which actually it was a godsend. If monitored by a physician, can be a relatively safe drug. We use it in kids with kidney disease all the time. Has the same physiologic effect, because it is a molecule that occurs in our body naturally, as living and training at altitude or using the altitude tents that are now available for people that don't live at altitude. So what's the ethical distinction that you make between that use of that drug and these other technologies?
Very, very good. First is, EPO came into use to raise the hematocrit of very anemic people to what would be low normal. And what the athletes do is use it to raise their hematocrit, which is, for those of you who aren't physiologists, hematocrit is just basically the percentage of red cells in your body. What percentage of a volume of blood is red cells? And normal is in the 30s, 40s. The athletes will get their hematocrits up into 50. And once you go over into the 50s, once you go over 50, your blood comes in danger of clotting. And when EPO first came out in 1988, it was no coincidence that in 1989, by mid-year, 19 Dutch cyclists had died in their sleep of a new condition called aortic plug, which was their blood clotted in their aortas in between heartbeats. And so, obviously, it's when the drug is used to enhance performance, but if you think about it, I think it is possible for an athlete who's anemic, I think it's possible to get a therapeutic use exemption from the US Anti-Doping Agency to bring up their hematocrit to a low normal level. You know, if they had some way to show that they, you know, that would be a reasonable level for them. I mean, I think it's possible. I think you can do it. It's only when the drug is abused. You know, not to make light of the Contador situation, but, you know, he's claiming that the steroids he took were in meat that he ate, and one of the experts on steroid use in cattle, which, by the way, is illegal in all of Europe, and out of thousands and thousands of tests of all the animals in that whole area of the world, they've had 1 or 2 or 3 positive. Okay. I call it the sun could rise in the West defense. Not, you know, it's not, it's not probable, but it's possible. Okay, it's amazing what athletes do, you know. I'm a doctor. Oh, I'm an athlete, trust me, yeah. The other part of your question about the altitude, what happens when you go to altitude is your hematocrit doesn't increase, your blood volume does. And that's how we can tell when someone trains at altitude. Yeah, your hematocrit will basically stay the same, but your volume goes up. And so that's the reaction of your body. And so I have no problem with people going to altitude to train, and I think that's been established, that's fine. And then the tents that people use in rooms and houses that they create at sea level, I'm fine with that too, because I also believe, just to now bring it back to my talk about the marathon and how for each individual it's that personal achievement. You know, they know what their goals are, they know how they want to achieve it. Well, at the highest level, you know, my attitude is all of the above. You do everything you think you need and should do to achieve at that high level. My view on someone who is using one of these hyperbolic chambers at sea level, rather than going to altitude, is they're not doing all they could do. You see, mentally. If they were doing all they could do, they'd move to altitude, but they don't want to be inconvenienced in moving somewhere. To me, in a sense, that's sort of a weakness in the overall preparation for the event. So, you know, you can enhance your performance by training at altitude, but you haven't taken anything to do it, and I think that's the difference.
So this will actually be our last question.
And,
Cheers, thank you. I wonder if there will be more popular support for testing the elites in sport if we also frowned on honor students, stockbrokers, doctors taking performance-enhancing drugs.
I know. You know, and yeah, again, this gets, I think, just again, my personal reaction to it is there will always be a certain segment of human society that wants an edge through doing something additional and artificial and perhaps borderline or, in fact, illegal. And then it becomes a case of, really, back in Washington, if you think about it, how much the people that can really influence a situation decide they want to deal, which, again, I think is a long-term health issue. I think, you know, I view taking those stimulants, and parenthetically, one of the first things we did at the US Anti-Doping Agency, to the chagrin of the supplement industry, Did I say industry or agency? US Anti-Doping Agency, to the chagrin of the supplement industry, is that we went to Washington and got a Fedra band, okay? And that wiped out about 60% of the shelf stock of most nutritional supplement stores, all right? It did. It did. Our figures, and just again, parenthetically, when we go, for example, and this gets to your question really, in high school, again, with this stuff, wanting the edge. Creatine, all of you have probably heard about that. The kids in high school taking creatine, this stuff, it's this, you know, it's this legal sort of bodybuilding stuff. Well, invariably, we will take sample testing off the shelves of supplement stores every couple of years, test them. 60% at least of the creatine we test is laced with a steroid called nandrolone, okay? Because the industry, thanks to Senator Orrin Hatch, is a food industry and not a drug industry. And so it's subject to no oversight at all. And if you think about it, if you're in the creatine, who is testing creatine to see if it's pure? The creatine manufacturers themselves are testing their opposition to see if it's pure. You see? And those are the only people testing the creatine in any way that would produce any result. And I may sound like I'm wandering here, but it's the same kind of mental set that goes on. And the other part of it, with the creatine analogy in parallel, is you don't know to what extent it is a placebo effect. You really don't. I mean, you know, does drinking 15 cups of coffee make you more alert and a better student? I mean, you know, you don't know. And perhaps they can do studies that will find this out, but a lot of it is, you know, again, this idea, if you think it's working, then it probably is. Just as with the steroids and the other performance-enhancing drugs, we have to wait for the longitudinal studies, the long-term studies, to come in to see what the impacts are. Just as, to segue back to professional football, all of a sudden they're realizing, boy, these players are in danger of lifetime effects of concussions. Duh. And you know, and again, with regard to this oversight and monitoring, the idea that now they're saying at all levels in contact sport like football, they need special trainers. I mean, we're talking Pee Wee football here, to have specially trained people there to monitor young children in that situation and to, you know, be on the lookout for concussions. And again, it's that same social attitude that, and this is a point I forgot to bring up in the talk, and I think it would be a good way to end it. You know, it's always fascinated me the level of denial and rationalization that has gone into this in our society. It really is. How much we've been willing to overlook in this area of sports. And that's why when you say, well, what about academics? I really think it's good and positive that the subject is actually even being brought up, that the fact that people are willing to discuss it. So with that, Tony, Carl, thank you. And good luck.